The Best Way to Explain It, Episode 20. All right, guys, welcome back. Another episode of The Best Way to Explain It, the podcast that's about as disappointing as finding raisins in what you thought were chocolate chip cookies. Oh, man, that is the most disappointing feeling in the world. So today, we actually have a very special guest. Today, we have our first ever guest. Unfortunately, it's just me today because Brecken actually works a real job, and I'm just kind of a bum sitting here at my parents' house on Christmas break. So I get to interview this guy, and so that's where Brecken's at. He's not quitting the show, even though he's missed a few episodes lately. He will be back for the next one. So, like I said, we have a special guest, our first ever guest, and this is a guy that's actually a really good friend of mine. He's a guy I really respect and really respect his intellect and those things. He's the founder of Freethinking Ministries. He's a PhD candidate at Northwest University in systematic theology. He's a doer of CrossFit and Kearney, Nebraska's own self-proclaimed apologeti. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome our first guest, Tim Stratton. Tim, how you doing?
Doing great, Scott. Thanks for having me on your show.
No problem. All right. Well, before we get started, well, for those of you who have looked at the title, we're going to be talking about free will, which is something that Tim has done a lot of work on. But before we get started with that, Tim, why don't you tell the audience how they can read your stuff, listen to what you have to say?
Well, I encourage everybody to go to freethinkingministries.com. That's my website, and I've assembled a little team of other free thinkers, and we try to think through a lot of challenging issues and discuss these things. So freethinkingministries.com.
Yeah. Do you have any books, journals, any journal articles, anything like that?
I'm working on a novel at the moment, and I hope to have my dissertation published as soon as I graduate, but don't hold your breath on that one. That's going to be at least a couple years from now.
Yeah. Nice. Well, that'll be cool. So, yeah, if you guys want to check out Tim's other work, if you like what he's saying, or if you are really enraged by the end of it and really disagree with him, he loves interaction. So go to freethinkingministries.com and he'll keep you up to date. So, Tim, today we're going to be talking about free will. This is a topic I know you have thought a lot about, that you, it's kind of, I would call you an expert on this topic. So how did you first really get interested in this topic? What made it click for you? Yeah, that's something I really want to know more about.
That's a really good question. I think, looking back, growing up, I had a lot of thoughts on these issues on free will and responsibility, and if everything was just determined. I guess I'd say I had some contradictory thoughts on the topic while I was growing up, but I didn't really realize that my views weren't coherent, or that they had some logical problems.
Yeah, contradicted itself.
Yeah, right. Man, it was probably around 2001 when a friend of mine really got me buying into the idea that there was no free will ever. And so after that, I considered myself to be a Calvinist. So I was I was a Christian who believed that God causally determined everything. So even before 2001, in the 90s, I remember studying Calvinism, and I guess I would say that I affirmed Calvinism in the 90s, but I became later what I refer to as a divine determinist, probably in 2001. And so again, I believe that God causally determined everything, including each and every one of my thoughts, my actions, my beliefs, and my behaviors. And I literally became, at least in my mind, a puppet on a string. And, I'm thinking back to that time. I think it was 99 when the first Matrix movie came out. And then the early 2000s, maybe 2003, 2004, I can't remember for sure when the other two
Something like that.
sequels came out, and so
we don't really talk about them.
You don't like to talk about the Matrix, no?
Well, not the sequels.
No, yeah, forget about the sequels. But those movies really, I guess, fueled this journey I was on, thinking about freedom, and that one time when Neo breaks the vase, and
right.
The Oracle says, "Well, what's really going to bake your noodle later is would you have broken the vase if I wouldn't have said anything?" That I remember that started getting me thinking about these issues again. So it's amazing how pop culture can play a role in that. And there was other things, other little catalysts along the way that would spark these trains of thought. But a few years later, these deterministic views were heavily reinforced after taking a class which was taught by a Calvinist who's a pastor, and he's even a published author on these issues. And he's a great guy, awesome. I just I consider him to be a dear friend to this day.
Okay. But
he really got me solidifying these divine deterministic views. So yeah, as I've said in the past, when it came to TULIP, the 5 points of Calvinism,
right?
I say that I bought it, taught it, screeched it, and preached it. I really believe that was true. But even stronger than TULIP, I would affirm that God causally determines everything. There was nothing outside of his control. And I made sense of that by saying that he causally determines all of it. So I really bought into the view, and I bought into it so much that it actually led to fights at home with my wife, because she thought this view was crazy. And how stupid.
So she was smarter than you.
Yeah, she was, and she'll be the first to tell you that. But there was one night where I slept on the couch over this issue. How stupid is that? But I was determined to believe in divine determinism, and I thought everybody should freely choose to believe in determinism. So
yeah, that's interesting.
I started to realize, it took a while, but I started to realize some
kind of the absurdity.
Yeah, there's some absurdity there, definitely.
Right. Cool. Well, there's a lot there. That's really interesting, because I don't think I'd ever heard you tell me that. I think you have an article about it, I believe.
Yeah.
About that.
I've got.
What's the name of it?
Molinism Saves Marriages, and we can talk about Molinism later probably, but basically that's a view that allows free will to exist. So.
Right. So real quick, for those of my audience, because it's not necessarily a Christian podcast, but for those in my audience who aren't familiar with terms like Calvinism and TULIP, can you just briefly say what you mean by those, or divine determinism, whatever those are?
Would just be the view that God, given the word divine, so God causally determines everything. And so by everything, if God determines all things, then all things includes all of my thoughts, my beliefs, my actions, and my behaviors. And he causally determines everything else too. If I drop my pencil, ultimately God was sovereign over that. So, so I still affirm sovereignty, even though I don't hold to divine determinism anymore. But the question is, well, how is God sovereign? Not if he is. Mm-hmm. But, so your question was define God's sovereignty, or I'm sorry,
Calvinism. So Calvinism, what would that be?
By Calvinism, I take it that one is a Calvinist if they affirm the 5 points of TULIP. So you got total depravity, and now I can't.
Unconditional election.
Unconditional election, limited atonement. I is irresistible grace, and then P is perseverance of the saints. Right. Now, my big problem is with the I, the irresistible grace. So, but I say that one is a Calvinist if they affirm the 5 points of TULIP. There's more to Calvinism than that. But when I was when I was a hardcore Calvinist, I was going to defend those 5 points and also that God causally determines everything.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. So that's cool. So that's what's meant by Calvinism and tulip. So those are some terms you'll hear thrown around, at least in the Christian community, around specifically the issue of free will. So with that being said, we kind of have this background of how you got interested in the topic. Can you give us kind of an overview of what the current free will debate is all about? Because I know there's several different prevailing views. And you don't have to tell us which one, though it's kind of obvious which one you hold to at this point. Just kind of outline what's the argument all about.
Okay. The debate can basically be broken down into a handful of camps, but it primarily comes down to two main views. And that would be one, that all things, this is how I like to break it down anyway. One, that all things about humanity are causally determined by things other than humanity. Okay, so that's the first thing, that all things about humanity are caused and determined by things other than humanity. And then two, the second view is that humans possess at least some what we call libertarian freedom, and not everything about humanity is causally determined by something or someone external to humanity. So there's some things that a human has a real choice in the matter. There's some things that are up to us and not up to other things other than us. So those are basically comes down to determinism is the first view. It's either divine or natural. So it's either the view that physics, chemistry, and maybe quantum mechanics determines everything about humanity. That'd be the natural deterministic view. And then there's divine determinism, that God determines all of those things about humanity.
Right.
And then underneath determinism, you've got some other views like compatibilism, where they try to make room for what they call free will, but they still affirm that all things are determined. And so I think there's, we can talk about that later, the problems with compatibilism. But that's still under the umbrella of determinism, because even they would affirm that all things are determined. So you got determinism, and then you got libertarianism, and that is
not the political view.
That's exactly right. It's just the view that, I like to say libertarianism is the view that there's some things that are up to me and not up to physics and chemistry, or not up to God. That there's some things that are up to me. A lot of people would say that libertarianism, or AKA libertarian free will, just means that there's some things that are up to you, and then some will add that whatever you choose, if you chose X, you could have chosen not X, right? You could choose otherwise. That's not everybody holds to that view, but that is my view, that there are some things that if I make one choice, I could have not made that choice and instead chose something different. But I think the best way to define libertarianism is to say it's a rejection of compatibilism and the affirmation that sometimes one is free. Okay. So, cool. Yeah, there's several different ways to define that, but anyway, that gives us something to go off of.
Right. Yeah. That's good. So because in order to be libertarian, in order to believe in libertarian free will, you have to specify it's just libertarian free will, not compatibilistic free will, that you would reject in order to be a libertarian.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything free about compatibilism, and so this gets us into another topic, but you've got people that affirm determinism, but then they either try to affirm a form of free will, what they call free will, and that, or they will affirm responsibility. And I argue that free will and responsibility are both illusory if all things really are determined by God or nature. There's nothing. Right. There's no freedom. You can put the label on it, but it's free in name only. And so theologians usually classify themselves in one of four camps. And, you've got your simple foreknowledge view. Those are usually Arminians who they want to say, yeah, the humans are free and God knows what we're going to do, but that's about the extent of it. There's not a lot regarding God's sovereignty there, at least not if God just simply knows what is going to happen in the future. He doesn't seem to be sovereign over it.
Right.
You've got open theism, which is the view that humans are free in a libertarian sense and thus responsible, but God doesn't know our free actions. Then you've got divine determinists, like I used to be, formerly a Calvinist. Again, I'm finding the more I press Calvinists, the more they will affirm some free will some of the time, in a libertarian sense even. But a lot of times it's Calvinists who affirm this divine deterministic view that God exhaustively, causally determines everything. So that's the divine determinism view. And then you've got the middle knowledge view, which is the Molinist view, or Molinism. And that's what I am. That's what I think is the inference to the best explanation. And that is, that allows for humans to have genuine libertarian free will, and God is sovereign over all those choices because he knew logically prior to his creative decree how we would freely choose if we were to exist, and he created this world anyway with our free actions in mind. So God created a world in which he knew how we would freely choose, and he could have created a different world or no world at all. And thus, God is sovereign over all of our free choices. So that's it in a nutshell.
Cool. So that's kind of both the secular and, specifically Christian free will debates. Okay, that's cool. So from what I've read from you, you typically approach this topic primarily from a philosophical perspective. So do you find it to be exclusively philosophical in nature, or are there other methods of investigation, like, I don't know, science, that you think might have something to say about it? So, or I don't know, like history or psychology. Are there other methods of investigation that, we need to understand what they might have to say about the issue?
Yeah, I think you need to pay attention to what anyone is saying on the issue. I mean, you have to at least listen to them. But this is a philosophical question, and so I do think the best way to answer this philosophical question is through philosophical means. So, with that said, however, I do think we need to pay attention to, if a neuroscientist has something to say on the matter, I'll listen to them. And usually they affirm determinism. And, theological data, what does, are there theological reasons? And in fact, historically speaking, I think you mentioned history in there. The great theologian from Spain named Luis de Molina, who started the view that I hold to today called Molinism, he actually started with biblical data to come to the conclusion that humanity possessed this genuine libertarian free will, at least some of the time. And so then he said, okay, well, how is God sovereign over that? And that led to another question. But he seemed to solve the problem. I think you need to look at, if a scientist has something to say about the issue. I mean, for example, Sam Harris comes to mind. He's written a book called Free Will, in which he argues that we do not possess free will. And he thinks that science backs that up. Well, I think he's got some major problems in his arguments, but I'm at least going to read his book. I'm gonna listen to him if he has something to say. But then I see, a lot of times I'll see scientists who make philosophical problems in their arguments,
dress it up as science.
Right. So ultimately, this is a philosophical question, and so philosophical means are the best way to handle these questions. It's metaphysical in nature.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that's interesting. Because, I just, whenever I'm reading about it on just, people post articles on different Facebook groups, and they'll say, like, science has disproven free will.
Right.
I don't know, that just kind of goes against my intuitions on it. Like, I don't know that science could necessarily do that. I don't know if that's the right tool to do it.
Right, you're exactly right. It's the wrong tool for the job. But I'll still listen to him.
Interesting.
Yeah, I'll listen to him.
Yeah. Right. Okay, cool. So now that we've kind of outlined the debate and figured out, okay, what tools we should be using to kind of resolve the issue, can you explain to us your reasons for holding to libertarian free will? So I know one of your arguments you like to talk about and write about is your freethinking argument, specifically against naturalism, though I know you do run it against, the Calvinists. So, and also maybe some of the reasons you might find determinism and compatibilism to be unsatisfactory.
Okay. So the freethinking argument that started out simply arguing against this naturalistic view of determinism. And the argument grew from there. It actually started out as, I think, 3 core premises, and it's expanded in both directions. I've added more premises to it and more conclusions. But the core was initially focused on naturalistic determinism. And what surprised me was that I was getting attacked not by naturalists or atheists, but by fellow Christians who were revolting against my argument because I was proving that libertarian free will exists, and that went against their theological beliefs.
Right. Well, that's no small feat to have an argument that deductively proves the existence of free
right.
will.
That is amazing. And I'll share the argument here.
That'd be great.
But it's one of the deductive conclusions is therefore libertarian free will exists, or the one I'm going to share with you now says therefore humans possess libertarian free will. But really quickly, the reasons why I hold libertarian freedom, primarily it has to do with rationality and knowledge gained from the process of rationality, in which I argue that if there's no libertarian free will as far as our thinking goes, then we can say goodbye to rationality and thus any knowledge gained through the process of rationality. And so that's called the freethinking argument. And then I've got another argument that's theological in nature. It's called the omni argument, and I can share that later too. Another argument by Peter Van Inwagen, which is called the consequence argument, which shows that the compatibilistic free will, or compatibilism that I've mentioned earlier, that doesn't work. And then finally, like Luis de Molina, as a Christian who thinks the Bible is the inspired Word of God, I believe that the Bible either teaches or heavily implies libertarian free will. So those are several reasons why I sincerely believe that we are free in a libertarian sense. So that free thinking argument, like I said, it started out against naturalism, but now I have other versions that I offer against divine determinists. But let's just focus on this one. The core of the argument first started out with, if humans do not possess libertarian free will, then humans do not possess the ability to gain inferential knowledge via the process of rationality. And then the next step was, humans do possess the ability to gain inferential knowledge via the process of rationality. And then the final conclusion was, therefore, humans possess libertarian free will. Now, I added to it. So the first premise is now the third premise. And there's 8 steps of the argument. So, again, I've played with the argument. This is my latest version, and I just gave you part of the latest version. I played around with the wording. This is where it's at currently. But it goes, premise 1, if naturalism is true, human nature does not include an immaterial soul. Okay, so by naturalism, I think it was Adam Johnson who, maybe he referenced Alvin Plantinga, I think, who said by naturalism, he means that that God or anything like God does not exist. So I also like to say, okay, because naturalism means different things to different people. So, a lot of times you'll use the words naturalism, materialism, and physicalism synonymously, but they're not always used synonymously by all people. So I'll say, okay, look, I'm talking about, on the view of naturalism, that there's nothing, that God or nothing like God exists. So that's to say there's no immaterial thinking things that exist.
Right.
And by naturalism, I take it that if all that exists is nature, and if science studies nature, then all that exists can at least possibly be tested or discovered by science.
Right.
So that's basically what I mean by naturalism. So again, premise 1 says, if naturalism is true, human nature does not include an immaterial soul. Next step says, premise 2 says, if human nature does not include an immaterial soul, then humans do not possess libertarian free will. I'll defend that here soon. 3, if humans do not possess libertarian free will, then humans do not possess the ability to gain inferential knowledge via the process of rationality. 4, humans do possess the ability to gain inferential knowledge via the process of rationality. And now I've got 3 deductive conclusions in a row. 5, therefore, humans possess libertarian free will. 6, therefore, human nature includes an immaterial soul. 7, therefore, naturalism is false. And 8, here's an abductive conclusion. The best explanation for the existence of the immaterial soul is God. And I then go on to argue the God of the Bible is actually the best explanation. So,
with that, so abductive means it doesn't follow necessarily from the premises, but it's like an inference to the best explanation.
Yes,
more or less.
That's exactly right.
Okay, cool. So yeah, I'll definitely I'll link to an article where you just give me what your favorite one where you defend this article, and I can link to that in the show notes page. So if people want to look at it, your first premise, if naturalism is true, then humans do not possess an immaterial soul. So what do you mean by that? So
I think basically I take it that premise 1 is synonymous with if naturalism is true, then nature is all that exists.
Okay.
Right. So if nature, only scientifically testable or discoverable things is all that exists, and there's no God or anything like God that exists, then obviously the human soul would not exist. So again, if naturalism is true, nature is all that exists. Only things that could possibly be tested or discovered by science.
Okay.
That's what I take naturalism to mean.
Do you find you get a lot of pushback on that premise?
No, I don't.
Okay.
Yeah, almost everybody accepts that.
Okay, so then your next step, if humans do not possess an immaterial soul, then we don't have libertarian free will, right?
Yeah. Okay. And the reason is because, again, with premise 1, if we're going to say, if naturalism is true, then nature is all that exists, like you said, I mean, nobody disagrees with that because that's the definition. Right. So if nature is all that exists, it stands to reason that if all that exists is nature, then all that exists is causally determined via the laws of nature. And, and maybe the events of nature, but there's nothing about, or I would say it better this way. If all that exists is nature and humanity is nothing but nature, then everything about humanity is causally determined via the laws of nature and the events of nature.
Right.
So there's nothing about the human that is ever really up to the human. It's all up to, if you will, things external to humanity.
Right. There's nothing outside the naturalistic kind of causal chain. There's nothing that could influence it.
Yeah, and I've played with this a bit even recently, even to interact with maybe quantum mechanics, which isn't necessary. I mean, there's disagreement here. We don't know for sure, but many physicists would say that quantum mechanics is indeterministic, and maybe that can provide some free will. But the thing is, it's not up to the quantum. Humans don't control the
they're not in control of the quantum vacuum. Yeah.
So it's either and again, many people say that quantum physics is deterministic. So there's debate there.
Mm-hmm.
But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that it is indeterministic. It's either the laws of physics and chemistry alone, or it's the laws of physics and chemistry and the events of the quantum world, none of which is up to the human, which determines everything about the human.
Right.
So, we don't get any escape routes, and Sam Harris even makes that clear in his book on free will.
Okay, so I'm with you there. Okay, and then your next step would be, if we don't have libertarian free will, then we can't, rationality and knowledge don't exist, right? Or we can't gain knowledge from that.
Yeah, I say that inferential knowledge can't be gained through a rational process.
Okay, what do you mean by that? Yeah.
Okay, so I guess, premise 3 is equivalent with, if all things are causally determined by the laws of nature or events of nature, then that includes all thoughts and beliefs. And so if I am not in control of any of my thoughts and beliefs, or my beliefs about my thoughts, or my thoughts about my beliefs, including this belief and thought that I'm having right now, those are all being forced upon me by external causes, then I stand in no position to say that I have inferred the best explanation. How do I know it's the best? I don't know if it is the best explanation, because other things other than me, have forced these thoughts and beliefs on me. They're forcing me to think one hypothesis is better than the other, but I stand in no position to know if it really is, because my thoughts that it's the best is forced upon me by things other than me, even if it's the worst option. But I would be determined to think it was the best, even if it is the worst. Those thoughts aren't up to me either. I literally cannot take my thoughts captive on this deterministic view. So because none of my thoughts are up to me. So, who was it? Or I've got a quote here from, let me see if I can find it here.
Okay. Yeah, so I think that kind of makes some sense. So if you don't have free will, you can't say this option is better than the other one, because if you are saying that, that means you were just determined to say that, and there was really no thinking, like you didn't have to deliberate in order to get to that particular conclusion.
Right. So
pretty much
deliberation becomes illusory on this view. So I like to argue that the process of rationality, if one is to engage in the process of rationality, they must first be able to think of and about options, say competing hypotheses. Then they have to be able to deliberate between the two views and really choose to consider different views. So you have to be able to think of and about competing hypotheses. You have to be able to deliberate between them. And then you have to be able to infer the best explanation and affirm that this is, in fact, the best explanation. And so without the ability to infer or affirm this choice of yours, the so-called choice, I would say, then you stand in no you don't have any justification for your beliefs.
Right.
If you're going to say that something other than you forces all your thoughts and beliefs upon you. And in fact, John Searle, who is an atheist and a well-respected philosopher of mind, he agrees with me. And in his book called Rationality in Action, he says actions are rationally accessible if and only if the actions are free. The reason for the connection is this: rationality must be able to make a difference. Rationality is possible only where there is a genuine choice between various rational and irrational courses of action. If the act is completely determined, then rationality can make no difference. It doesn't even come into play, end quote. So, I argue that you can't engage in the process of rationality. There's no real deliberation there if none of your thoughts and beliefs or how you think about things is up to you. And then John Searle makes it even stronger and says, look, rationality only makes sense if there's freedom to legitimately choose between rational actions and irrational actions. And if you don't have that a real freedom to choose there, then what the heck? So, it goes down the drain.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So, but then you go to argue, well, obviously rationality and knowledge do exist because we presumably know some things. That'd be kind of an absurd view to, well, you'd have to know that we don't know things. Right?
That's right. That's right.
Self-refuting.
Yeah, to say, and I have, in having some debates with, there was this Australian blogger, an atheist blogger from Australia, who wound up, he first tried to argue against premise 3, eventually saw that he can't do that. He then went to premise 2 and tried to refute that one because he doesn't like where it's going. He doesn't like my conclusions, right? He's committed to his atheism and his determinism, actually. Mm-hmm. So he tried to refute 3, and that one took a while, but after he realized, man, I can't let go of 3, then he went to number 2. It didn't take long for him to say, okay, I can't refute 2. He went to number 1 really quickly, and then he jumped to 4 and said, okay, no, this is what I disagree with. And so
it's a compliment to your argument, though.
Well, that I did take it as a compliment.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you're, premise 4, the current version, the old version, I just said rationality and knowledge exist. This one is a little more careful, and I say humans do possess the ability to gain inferential knowledge via the process of rationality. Now, if he rejects that, then why should I trust anything he thinks?
Right.
He doesn't have the ability, according to him, to gain this kind of knowledge. Mm-hmm. So why listen to anything he says? He's shooting himself in the foot.
Well, and does he know that premise to be false?
Yeah.
He can't.
Right. Yeah, he's just determined to think that, according to him. So yeah, it becomes self-refuting at that point.
Right.
So then you've got 3 deductive conclusions that follow. If those 4 premises stand strong, the 3 deductive conclusions follow. Therefore, humans possess libertarian free will. Therefore, human nature includes an immaterial soul. And then, therefore, naturalism is false. So, again, the core of the argument is steps 3, 4, and 5. And so you can just end with the strong deductive argument or conclusion that free will exists, libertarian free will exists.
Right.
But we can have fun and expand it in both directions and reach some other conclusions too. And I do sincerely think there is an immaterial aspect to human nature, and that is it makes sense then that we would be able to freely think if there was an immaterial aspect to human nature and to the human mind. So that's why I call myself normally it's atheists that like to call themselves free thinkers, but I take that label from them and say no, it's really Christians who have this view, especially if you have a view that there's an immaterial aspect to your existence, who can be a substance dualist, who are substance dualists who can sincerely call themselves free thinkers.
Right. Okay. So for those people who are wary about this word soul that you're saying, can you comfort some of those fears about how theological that might sound, even if obviously you do believe there is a theological context to it.
Right.
So, because it seems to me it doesn't need to be, there needs to be something immaterial, right?
I think that makes the most sense of the biblical data, especially when you think about God. I mean, the Bible in John actually says God is spirit. Mm-hmm. So what does that mean? Well, a spiritual substance is not a physical substance. So it's a spirit or a spiritual substance would not be the type of thing that science has access to.
Right.
So it's an immaterial, non-natural, non-material, non-physical type of thing.
Right.
So So yeah, the soul, first you just think about God and what he would be like. So he's spirit. And plus, if you study the Kalam cosmological argument, that's one of the rational inferences is that God must, or the creator of the universe, whatever it is, whatever caused the universe, has to be something that is immaterial, supernatural, non-physical, spaceless, things like that. So a nice word for that is spirit. Well, if God is spirit, and then according to Genesis 1:26 and 27, that humanity is created in the image of God or the likeness of God, then it stands to reason that there is that immaterial aspect of humanity too. I mean, God can't be a body. He's not a skeleton with a muscle structure.
Right.
He doesn't have skin, right? Another reason why racism is stupid, because God doesn't have skin. He's the creator of matter, which includes skeletons and muscles and skin and everything material about the human. So what is it about God that makes us in his image? Well, it would be that immaterial aspect that allows us to freely think. We're free thinkers, just like God is. So when I talk about the soul, I'm talking about the part of humanity that's created in the image / likeness of God, that's immaterial and can exist apart from the body. Paul made it clear. He believed that to be absent from the body was to be present with the Lord. And there's another time where he's talking about he didn't know if he had a vision or if he actually left his body and went to heaven. And he says, I don't know what one happened, but both are possible, basically. So Paul makes it clear. He really believes that there is what we call substance dualism, that he's a soul with a body, and he can, at death, or if God takes him in some other manner, can exist apart from the body. I believe that too. I'm willing to be wrong on that, but I think that's definitely the best explanation. And also when Jesus talks to the thief on the cross, he tells him, today you will be with me in paradise. Well, his body was still on earth.
Right.
So there's something that had to happen there. So it seems like we have good biblical reason to affirm what we call substance dualism. That just means that I am a soul who has a body. I'm a physical substance and a immaterial, supernatural substance, if you will. Just other than nature is all supernatural means.
And this is all where you kind of get your abductive conclusion, right?
Yes.
These types of reasons.
Excuse me. The final conclusion, the best explanation for the existence of the immaterial soul is God. And then I argue the biblical view of God. And I've got an article called The Image of God on my website. So if people want to, maybe you can link that, or people can search for it.
Sure,
so I do talk about this argument, the free thinking argument, and then I connect that with the Kalam argument and show how that supports the final abductive conclusion of the free thinking argument.
Nice. All right. So that's why you think, that's one of the big reasons why you're a libertarian in the free will sense, right?
Yeah, that's one of the big reasons.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any other just reasons, or more like why you don't think determinism and compatibilism, or is mainly just the...
Well, I've got my theological reasons too, and I offered this in what's called the Omni argument.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'll fly over this really quick for you.
Yeah.
This gets us back to what I was talking about earlier with Tulip, the 5 points of Calvinism, and namely that irresistible grace, and that's the eye of Tulip. But I argue here, premise one, if irresistible grace, or the eye of Tulip, is true, then for any person X, if God desires to, has the power to, and knows how to cause X to go to heaven and not suffer eternally in hell, then X will go to heaven and not suffer eternally in hell. 2, if God is omnibenevolent, omnipotent, and omniscient, then for any person X, God desires to, has the power to, and knows how to cause X to go to heaven and not suffer eternally in hell. 3, there is at least one person who will not go to heaven and suffers eternally in hell. 4. Therefore, here's a deductive conclusion. One cannot affirm both, 1, that irresistible grace is true, and 2, that God is omnibenevolent, omnipotent, and omniscient, aka a maximally great being. 5, here's another premise. God is a maximally great being. 6, here's another deductive conclusion. Therefore, irresistible grace is false. 7, another deductive conclusion. Therefore, divine determinism is false. God does not causally determine all things. 8, God is another premise. God is completely sovereign and does predestine all things. We get this in Romans 8, 29 and 30, Ephesians 1, 5 and 11. Here's another deductive conclusion from that. Therefore, predestination and determinism are not to be conflated. And finally, here's another abductive conclusion to finish with. The best explanation of all the data is Molinism. So here, I've got a conclusion here that says, therefore, irresistible grace is false. Then the next one, therefore, divine determinism is false. And I follow that in parentheses saying the reason why is God does not causally determine all things. If God did causally determine all things, then irresistible grace would be true. But I've got an argument here against irresistible grace. So I start off with this purely philosophical or a metaphysical argument. That's my primary reason for rejecting determinism. And like I said, you can switch some of those words around. I've got another article on my website called A Revised Freethinking Argument, Killing Two Birds with One Stone. And in that I reword it in such a way that it takes down both naturalistic determinism and divine determinism. Mm-hmm. So there's that's a reason to reject determinism of any stripe, whether it be naturalistic or divine. Here I've got an argument against divine determinism in the omni argument. So those are the two big reasons. And I guess I would also say as a Christian, and I referenced this earlier, the third main reason, I've got three pillars here, so to speak, is biblical data. I sincerely think there's so much data we can glean from Scripture alone that if it doesn't teach it, some people say, well, it doesn't teach it. Then I'll say, okay, look, it heavily implies, it screams, if you will, that sometimes humans possess this libertarian freedom, and I would even go farther and say an ability to do otherwise. Mm-hmm. So, so I've got the free-thinking argument, the omni argument, biblical data, and then I guess, Peter Van Inwagen has an argument called the consequence argument that refutes or argues against
compatibilism, right?
Compatibilism, yeah.
So, with compatibilism being the sense that both determinism and free will can be true. Which, yeah. Okay.
And you've got naturalists that hold compatibilism and theologians, namely Calvinists, often affirm compatibilism. Mm-hmm. And I've written a lot on why compatibilism is absurd. In fact, that's the title of an upcoming article that I've written. It's not out quite yet, but it'll be out soon. Mm. So anyway.
Awesome.
Yeah, I'd just say the consequence argument can be summed up. Better sum this up for your listeners.
Yeah.
And two rules that we call Rule Alpha and Rule Beta. Rule Alpha says there is nothing anyone can do to change what must be the case. And then Rule Beta says if there is nothing anyone can do to change X and nothing anyone can do to change the fact that Y is a necessary consequence of X, then there is nothing anyone can do to change Y either. So there's some people will say, there's nothing anyone can do to change X, but if one does Y, Y is free because it follows from X. But hey, if Y follows necessarily from X, and there's nothing you can do to change X, and there's nothing you can do to change the fact that Y necessarily follows from X, and there's nothing free about Y at all. So compatibilism just doesn't work. And
Right.
this has been called the transfer of powerlessness principle. And Robert Kane puts it well. He says our powerlessness to change X transfers to anything that necessarily follows from X. So anyway, I've written several articles on compatibilism. It's on freethinkingministries.com.
Sweet.
And I've got 2 more articles on it that aren't published that will be in the next few weeks.
Sounds good. All right. So that's kind of your reasons for holding to libertarian free will. Just real quickly, what do you regard as like the basic intellectual challenge you think that's facing libertarian free will today? Like what would you say is the most, I mean, I know you are a libertarian in that sense. What would you say is what's the biggest difficulty you think with the libertarian free will view, and how would you say that you might refute it?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I guess, I typically get challenged on 2 fronts. Like I said, there's atheists who believe that only the physical, material, scientifically testable world exists. Not all atheists think that. Okay, but most atheists are naturalists,
Mm-hmm.
and all naturalists would be atheists. But
Right.
So that's typically their view. And so these folks will assume determinism is true. And then I also get challenged by the Calvinists or divine determinists of others, of any stripe, who often assume, well, obviously, that God causally determines everything because they're
Right.
divine determinists. So
Right.
I guess from the first camp, the question is raised, well, how could libertarian free will exist if human nature is only physical? Well,
Maybe it's not.
right. My response is to challenge that assumption
Right.
that we are only physical.
Well, because
And
you'd
then-
agree with them, right?
I
If
do
human
agree
nature
with
is
that.
just physical, then
Right.
we don't have libertarian free will.
I agree with that. I think that at least stands to reason that seems to be probably true anyway. And I'm still trying to find. I'm open. I mean, if somebody shows me how one can sincerely possess libertarian freedom to think on a purely physical view of reality, then I'd be open to that, and I would restructure my argument.
Mm-hmm.
But by the way, the core of my argument would still remain
Right.
intact.
Libertarian free will would still be proven.
Right, and that's really my main focus.
Mm-hmm.
I just feel like, man, if we can prove libertarian free will, then the soul and God come along for free.
Mostly, yeah.
Yeah. They're along for the ride. I could be wrong on that. I don't think I am. I definitely think it's the best explanation. But I'm really laser focused on the ability to freely think. If there is no free will, then there's no free thinking. And if there's no free thinking, then why should you trust any of your thoughts?
Mm-hmm.
At least most of them. And especially when it comes to, the disagreements in metaphysics. If we're going to say that all of our beliefs are causally determined by things other than us, well, what do we do when we disagree on matters? I mean, God or nature force one person to think X and another person to think Y. Well, we stand in no position to even evaluate those thoughts because our evaluative thoughts are also not up to us. They're determined by God or nature. So we've just got problems all the way around as soon as you affirm determinism. But again, they will say, how could libertarian free will exist if human nature is only physical? I agree with them. It's hard to make sense of that. So my response is to challenge that assumption. Mm-hmm. And then I give them the free thinking argument, which deductively concludes that there is an immaterial aspect to the human nature. So now the theologians offer a different objection. And this, I feel like I argue with theologians more than I do, with my fellow Christians more than I do atheists. But they'll typically say something like, well, how can God be sovereign and in control over all things if humans are free and responsible for some things? And, and again, sometimes they'll try to get around this by offering that compatibilism, that determinism is true and we're still free and responsible. but that doesn't work. And they'll say, well, no, that's taught in the Bible. Compatibilists will say that.
Right.
And I'll say, no, what's taught in the Bible is that God predestines all things and that humans are free and responsible for some things. And those two things, predestination and human freedom, are not logically incompatible or mutually exclusive. But divine determinism, divine causal determinism over all things, is logically incompatible with saying that humans are free and responsible over some things. But predestination is the word the Bible uses over and over again, that God predestines all things, and I affirm that. I affirm that God predestines all things and that humans are free and responsible over some things. And I think Molinism, so to those who offer that objection, I say, look, Molinism is the answer. Molinism shows how God can be sovereign even over your genuinely free thoughts and actions.
Right.
So
okay. So yeah. So those are kind of your two main challenges, and yeah. Okay, that's interesting. So we kind of talked about this a little bit just because, the nature of the conclusions of your free thinking argument, but are there any other implications you think for holding to libertarian free will? So say you've proven that libertarian free will exists. Are there any other implications, or have we kind of covered them all?
So, you're saying suppose my argument passes and
right.
libertarian free will exists. Well, I think the best explanation, if one comes to affirm and see that my argument is valid and sound, and so they should trust that conclusion, then, like I said, I think they should eventually come to the conclusion that atheism is false ultimately. Excuse me, because God would be the inference of the best explanation of the ability for humans to freely think and not be causally determined by physics and chemistry or what have you.
So would you say that maybe that reason is why a lot of people why you tend to see a lot of like scientists and philosophers holding to views like determinism? Would you say it's because of those reasons?
I think
just because of the implications.
Well, I think often a scientist might assume that there's nothing immaterial. The only things that exist is what he could potentially find, test, or discover, or whatever in the lab, or by doing science. Mm-hmm. But if you start with that assumption, but you just have to start out by showing, look, this is an assumption. It's not guaranteed to be true here. You just presupposing that you, as a scientist, have the means to discover everything that exists. And if that's the case, then there can't be anything outside of the realm of science. And so if that's the case, then say goodbye to God or anything like God. And so the human soul just couldn't exist. Now, not all scientists hold to that assumption. They don't all start with that, but there's many who do. And I think that starting with that assumption leads to them then saying, well, gosh, if all that exists is nature, then all that exists must be causally determined by the laws of nature or events of nature. So everything about the human is determined by nature in some form or fashion. And like I said, I think that if that assumption is true, I think they're right. It's at least the best explanation. It stands to reason. Okay. I think that assumption is wrong. So, and I argue that it's wrong.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. That's interesting. So like you're focusing on, so in your dissertation now, you're sort of focusing on this, but more specifically, I think it's on God's sovereignty and human freedom. Is that?
Yeah. And so
more or less.
I'm dealing with determinism through, I'll be talking about, I'll be bringing in the free thinking argument, talking about the problems with naturalistic determinism and divine determinism. So I'm starting out basically, as a theologian looking at the biblical data, but then I'm going to go into metaphysics and, take some little trips in and into metaphysics and philosophy and get into these issues too. So yeah, I'm really, I'm in the middle of it right now, and I'm learning so much, and it's blowing my mind the more I study every day. But
that's awesome.
Yeah, look forward to
it. So once that's done, once your dissertation's done, you can almost see the end in a few years. What other topics kind of interest you? What other fields that you think, hey, I'd like to do a little bit more research into that?
Yeah, I would say that the two notes of interest for me, probably I'd start with the metaphysics of time, of all things. I get into that every once in a while, and it's kind of distantly related to the free will debate, and I've got into that on my website here and there. But yeah, time, and also I guess meta-ethics. You and I have had some conversations on this before. What it means to be good. So I guess just morality and objective goodness and badness and what all that stuff means and how we make sense of it. Yeah, so I'll either go one of those two routes when I'm done with my dissertation, I think.
Sweet. That's cool. Well, man, I really appreciate you coming on and blowing our minds and talking about free will. And you do a better job explaining this stuff than I do, so I figured it'd be a good idea to get you on to talk about it.
Man, let's do it again sometime. Thanks.
Yeah, for sure, dude. We'll have to get you on sometime about something else that you want to talk about. And yeah, really appreciate it, man. Thanks for talking.
Sounds good. You bet.
Oh wait, just real quick. Just reminder, find you at freethinkingministries.com.
That's right.
That Twitter, what do you at Twitter? You active?
Yeah. TS Express. It's capital TSX and then lowercase PRESS.
Okay, cool. So yeah, and then you can like Freethinking Ministries on Facebook.
On Facebook, yeah.
And you'll get notified for all the new articles. Sweet.
That's right.
So I just wanted to make sure and let everybody know about that. Tim, really appreciate it, man. Have a good day, man.
You do the same. Talk to you soon. Merry Christmas.
Yeah, Merry Christmas.